Hi everyone, the Gazette has a new name. It's now called Nostalgia USA, and each month it's getting better. A real entertainment experience. And within each issue there will be special pricing on selected oldtimeradiodvd.com collections, only available to our subscribers of the Nostalgia USA. Take advantage today by subscribing at oldtimeradiodvd.com. Nostalgia USA, special pricing. What a combination. Go to oldtimeradiodvd.com today. You'll be glad you did.
Let's now join our featured presentation.
The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Chapter 7. A retrospect, growth of sectional rivalry, the generosity of Virginia, unequal accessions of territory, the tariffs and its effects, the Republican Convention of 1860, its resolutions and its nominations, the Democratic Convention at Charleston, its divisions and disruption, the nominations at Baltimore, the Constitutional Union Party and its nominees, an effort in behalf of agreement declined by Mr. Douglas, the election of Lincoln and Hamlin, proceedings in the South, evidences of calmness and deliberation, Mr. Buchanan's conservatism and the weakness of his position, Republican taunts, the New York Tribune, etc. When at the close of the War of the Revolution, each of the 13 colonies that had been engaged in that contest was severally acknowledged by the mother country, Great Britain, to be a free and independent state, the confederation of those states embraced an area so extensive, with climate and products so various, that rivalries and conflicts of interest soon began to be manifested. It required all the power of wisdom and patriotism, animated by the affection engendered by common sufferings and dangers, to keep these rivalries under restraint, and to effect those compromises which it was fondly hoped would ensure the harmony and mutual good offices of each for the benefit of all. It was in this spirit of patriotism and confidence in the continuance of such abiding goodwill as would for all time preclude hostile aggression that Virginia ceded, for the use of the Confederated States, all that vast extent of territory lying north of the Ohio River, out of which have since been formed 5 states and part of a 6th. The addition of these states has accrued entirely to the preponderance of the northern section over that from which the donation proceeded, and to the disturbance of that equilibrium which existed at the close of the War of the Revolution. It may not be out of place here to refer to the fact that the grievances which led to that war were directly inflicted upon the northern colonies. Those of the South had no material cause of complaint, but, actuated by sympathy for their northern brethren and a devotion to the principles of civil liberty and community independence, which they had inherited from their Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and which were set forth in the Declaration of Independence, they made common cause with their neighbors, and may, at least, claim to have done their full share in the war that ensued. By the exclusion of the South in 1820 from all that part of the Louisiana Purchase lying north of the parallel of 36 degrees 30 minutes, and not included in the State of Missouri, by the extension of that line of exclusion to embrace the territory acquired from Texas, and by the appropriation of all the territory obtained from Mexico under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, both north and south of that line, it may be stated, with approximate accuracy, that the North had monopolized to herself more than 3/4 of all that had been added to the domain of the United States since the Declaration of Independence. This inequality, which began, as has been shown, in the more generous than wise confidence of the South, was employed to obtain for the North the lion's share of what was afterward added at the cost of the public treasure and the blood of patriots. I do not care to estimate the relative proportion contributed by each of the 2 sections. Nor was this the only cause that operated to disappoint the reasonable hopes and to blight the fair prospects under which the original compact was formed. The effects of discriminating duties upon imports have been referred to in a former chapter, favoring the manufacturing region, which was the North, burdening the exporting region, which was the South, and so imposing upon the latter a double tax: one, by the increased price of articles of consumption, which, so far as they were of home production, went into the pockets of the manufacturer; the other, by the diminished value of articles of export, which was so much withheld from the pockets of the agriculturist. In like manner, the power of the majority section was employed to appropriate to itself an unequal share of the public disbursements. These combined causes, the possession of more territory, more money, and a wider field for the employment of special labor, all served to attract immigration, and, with increasing population, the greed grew by what it fed on. This became distinctly manifest when the so-called Republican Convention assembled in Chicago on May 16, 1860, to nominate a candidate for the presidency. It was a purely sectional body. There were a few delegates present, representing an insignificant minority in the border States, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, but not one from any State south of the celebrated political line of 36 degrees 30 minutes. It had been the invariable usage with nominating conventions of all parties to select candidates for the presidency and vice presidency, one from the North and the other from the South. But this assemblage nominated Mr. Lincoln of Illinois for the first office, and for the second Mr. Hamlin of Maine, both Northerners. Mr. Lincoln, its nominee for the presidency, had publicly announced that the Union could not permanently endure half slave and half free. The resolutions adopted contained some carefully worded declarations, well adapted to deceive the credulous who were opposed to hostile aggressions upon the rights of the States. In order to accomplish this purpose, they were compelled to create a fictitious issue, in denouncing what they described as the new dogma that the Constitution of its own force carries slavery into any or all of the territories of the United States, a dogma which had never been held or declared by anybody, and which had no existence outside of their own assertion. There was enough in connection with the nomination to assure the most fanatical foes of the Constitution that their ideas would be the rule and guide of the party. Meantime, the Democratic party had held a convention composed, as usual, of delegates from all the States. They met in Charleston, South Carolina, on April 23d, but an unfortunate disagreement with regard to the declaration of principles to be set forth rendered a nomination impracticable. Both divisions of the convention adjourned, and met again in Baltimore in June. Then, having finally failed to come to an agreement, they separated and made their respective nominations apart. Mr. Douglas of Illinois was nominated by the friends of the doctrine of popular sovereignty, with Mr. Fitzpatrick of Alabama for the vice presidency. Both these gentlemen at that time were senators from their respective States. Mr. Fitzpatrick promptly declined the nomination, and his place was filled with the name of Mr. Herschel V. Johnson, a distinguished citizen of Georgia. The convention representing the conservative or state rights wing of the Democratic Party, the president of which was the Honorable Caleb Cushing of Massachusetts, on the first ballot unanimously made choice of John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, then Vice President of the United States, for the first office, and, with like unanimity, selected General Joseph Lane, then a senator from Oregon, for the second. The resolutions of each of these two conventions denounced the action and policy of the abolition party as subversive of the Constitution and revolutionary in their tendency. Another convention was held in Baltimore about the same period by those who still adhered to the old Whig party, reinforced by the remains of the American organization and, perhaps, some others. This convention also consisted of delegates from all the States, and, repudiating all geographical and sectional issues, and declaring it to be both the part of patriotism and of duty to recognize no political principle other than the Constitution of the country, the Union of the States, and the enforcement of the laws, pledged itself and its supporters to maintain, protect, and defend, separately and unitedly, those great principles of public liberty and national safety against all enemies at home and abroad. Its nominees were Messrs. John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts, both of whom had long been distinguished members of the Whig party. The people of the United States now had 4 rival tickets presented to them by as many contending parties, whose respective position and principles on the great and absorbing question at issue may be briefly recapitulated as follows. 1. The Constitutional Union Party, as it was now termed, led by Messrs. Bell and Everett, which ignored the territorial controversy altogether, and contented itself, as above stated, with a simple declaration of adherence to the Constitution, the Union, and the enforcement of the laws. 2. The party of popular sovereignty, headed by Douglas and Johnson, who affirmed the right of the people of the territories, in their territorial condition, to determine their own organic institutions, independently of the control of Congress, denying the power or duty of Congress to protect the persons or property of individuals or minorities in such territories against the action of majorities. 3. The State Rights Party, supporting Breckinridge and Lane, who held that the territories were open to citizens of all the States, with their property, without any inequality or discrimination, and that it was the duty of the General Government to protect both persons and property from aggression in the territories subject to its control. At the same time, they admitted and asserted the right of the people of a territory, on emerging from their territorial condition to that of a State, to determine what should then be their domestic institutions, as well as all other questions of personal or proprietary right, without interference by Congress, and subject only to the limitations and restrictions prescribed by the Constitution of the United States. 4. The so-called Republicans, presenting the names of Lincoln and Hamlin, who held, in the language of one of their leaders, that slavery can exist only by virtue of municipal law, that there was no law for it in the territories, and no power to enact one, and that Congress was bound to prohibit it in or exclude it from any and every federal territory. In other words, they asserted the right and duty of Congress to exclude the citizens of half the States of the Union from the territory belonging in common to all, unless on condition of the sacrifice or abandonment of their property recognized by the Constitution, indeed, of the only species of their property distinctly and specifically recognized as such by that instrument. On the vital question underlying the whole controversy, that is, whether the Federal Government should be a government of the whole for the benefit of all its equal members, or, if it should continue to exist at all, a sectional government for the benefit of a part, the first three of the parties above described were in substantial accord as against the fourth. If they could or would have acted unitedly, they could certainly have carried the election, and averted the catastrophe which followed. Nor were efforts wanting to effect such a union. Mr. Bell, the Whig candidate, was a highly respectable and experienced statesman, who had filled many important offices, both State and Federal. He was not ambitious to the extent of coveting the presidency, and he was profoundly impressed by the danger which threatened the country. Mr. Breckinridge had not anticipated, and, it may safely be said, did not eagerly desire the nomination. He was young enough to wait, and patriotic enough to be willing to do so, if the weal of the country required it. Thus much I may confidently assert of both those gentlemen, for each of them authorized me to say that he was willing to withdraw, if an arrangement could be effected by which the divided forces of the friends of the Constitution could be concentrated upon someone more generally acceptable than either of the three who had been presented to the country. When I made this announcement to Mr. Douglas, with whom my relations had always been such as to authorize the assurance that he could not consider it as made in an unfriendly spirit, he replied that the scheme proposed was impracticable, because his friends, mainly Northern Democrats, if he were withdrawn, would join in the support of Mr. Lincoln, rather than of any one that should supplant him, Douglas, that he was in the hands of his friends, and was sure they would not accept the proposition. It needed but little knowledge of the status of parties in the several States to foresee a probable defeat if the conservatives were to continue divided into three parts, and the aggressives were to be held in solid column. But angry passions, which are always bad counselors, had been aroused, and hopes were still cherished, which proved to be illusory. The result was the election by a minority of a President whose avowed principles were necessarily fatal to the harmony of the Union. Of 303 electoral votes, Mr. Lincoln received 180, but of the popular suffrage of 4,676,853 votes, which the electors represented, he obtained only 1,866,352, something over a third of the votes. This discrepancy was owing to the system of voting by general ticket, that is, casting the State votes as a unit, whether unanimous or nearly equally divided. Thus, in New York, the total popular vote was 675,156, of which 362,646 were cast for the so-called Republican or Lincoln electors, and 312,510 against them. New York was entitled to 35 electoral votes. Divided on the basis of popular vote, 19 of these would have been cast for Mr. Lincoln and 16 against him. But under the general ticket system, the entire 35 votes were cast for the Republican candidates, thus giving them not only the full strength of the majority in their favor, but that of the great minority against them superadded. So, of other Northern States in which the small majorities on one side operated with the weight of entire unanimity, while the virtual unanimity in the Southern States on the other side counted nothing more than a mere majority would have done. The manifestations which followed this result in the Southern States did not proceed, as has been unjustly charged, from chagrin at their defeat in the election, or from any personal hostility to the President-elect, but from the fact that they recognized in him the representative of a party professing principles destructive to their peace, their prosperity, and their domestic tranquility. The long-suppressed fire burst into frequent flame, but it was still controlled by that love of the Union which the South had illustrated in every battlefield from Boston to New Orleans. Still, it was hoped against hope that some adjustment might be made to avert the calamities of a practical application of the theory of an irrepressible conflict. Few, if any, then doubted the right of a State to withdraw its grants delegated to the Federal Government, or, in other words, to secede from the Union. But in the South this was generally regarded as the remedy of last resort, to be applied only when ruin or dishonor was the alternative. No rash or revolutionary action was taken by the Southern States, but the measures adopted were considerate, and executed advisedly and deliberately. The presidential election occurred, as far as the popular vote which determined the result was concerned, in November, 1860. Most of the State legislatures convened soon afterward in regular session. In some cases, special sessions were convoked for the purpose of calling State conventions, the recognized representatives of the sovereign will of the people, to be elected expressly for the purpose of taking such action as should be considered needful and proper under the existing circumstances. These conventions, as it was always held and understood, possessed all the power of the people assembled in mass, and therefore it was conceded that they, and they only, could take action for the withdrawal of a State from the Union. The consent of the respective States to the formation of the Union had been given through such conventions, and it was only by the same authority that it could properly be revoked. The time required for this deliberate and formal process precludes the idea of hasty or passionate action, and none who admit the primary power of the people to govern themselves can consistently deny its validity and binding obligation upon every citizen of the several States. Not only was there ample time for calm consideration among the people of the South, but for due reflection by the General Government and the people of the Northern States. President Buchanan was in the last year of his administration. His freedom from sectional asperity, his long life in the public service, and his peace-loving and conciliatory character were all guarantees against his precipitating a conflict between the Federal Government and any of the States. But the feeble power that he possessed in the closing months of his term to mold the policy of the future was painfully evident. Like all who had intelligently and impartially studied the history of the formation of the Constitution, he held that the Federal Government had no rightful power to coerce a State. Like the sages and patriots who had preceded him in the high office that he filled, he believed that our Union rests upon public opinion, and can never be cemented by the blood of its citizens shed in civil war. If it cannot live in the affections of the people, it must one day perish. Congress may possess many means of preserving it by conciliation, but the sword was not placed in their hand to preserve it by force. Message of December 3, 1860. 10 years before, Mr. Calhoun, addressing the Senate with all the earnestness of his nature, and with that sincere desire to avert the danger of disunion, which those who knew him best never doubted, had asked the emphatic question, "How can the Union be saved?" He answered his question thus: "There is but one way which it can be saved with any certainty, and that is by a full and final settlement on the principles of justice of all the questions at issue between the sections. The South asks for justice, simple justice, and less she ought not to take. She has no compromise to offer but the Constitution, and no concession or surrender to make. Can this be done? Yes, easily. Not by the weaker party, for it can of itself do nothing, not even protect itself, but by the stronger. But will the North agree to do this? It is for her to answer this question. But I will say she cannot refuse if she has half the love of the Union which she professes to have, nor without exposing herself to the charge that her love of power and aggrandizement is far greater than her love of the Union." During the 10 years that intervened between the date of this speech and the message of Mr. Buchanan cited above, the progress of sectional discord and the tendency of the stronger section to unconstitutional aggression had been fearfully rapid. With very rare exceptions, there were none in 1850 who claimed the right of the Federal Government to apply coercion to a State. In 1860, men had grown to be familiar with threats of driving the South into submission to any act that the Government, in the hands of a Northern majority, might see fit to perform. During the canvass of that year, demonstrations had been made by quasi-military organizations in various parts of the North, which looked unmistakably to purposes widely different from those enunciated in the preamble to the Constitution, and to the employment of means not authorized by the powers which the States had delegated to the Federal Government. Well-informed men still remember that in the convention which framed the Constitution, a proposition was made to authorize the employment of force against a delinquent State, on which Mr. Madison remarked that the use of force against the State would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment, and would probably be considered by the party attacked as a dissolution of all previous compacts by which it might have been bound. The convention expressly refused to confer the power proposed, and the clause was lost. While, therefore, in 1860, many violent men, appealing to passion and the lust of power, were inciting the multitude and preparing Northern opinion to support a war waged against the Southern States in the event of their secession, there were others who took a different view of the case. Notable among such was the New York Tribune, which had been the organ of the abolitionists, and which now declared that if the Cotton States wished to withdraw from the Union, they should be allowed to do so; that any attempt to compel them to remain by force would be contrary to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and to the fundamental ideas upon which human liberty is based, and that if the Declaration of Independence justified the secession from the British Empire of 3 millions of subjects in 1776, it was not seen why it would not justify the secession of 5 millions of Southerners from the Union in 1861. Again, it was said by the same journal that sooner than compromise with the South and abandon the Chicago platform, they would let the Union slide. Taunting expressions were freely used, as, for example, "If the Southern people wish to leave the Union, we will do our best to forward their views." All this, it must be admitted, was quite consistent with the oft-repeated declaration that the Constitution was a "covenant with hell," which stood as the caption of a leading abolitionist paper of Boston. That signs of coming danger so visible, evidences of hostility so unmistakable, disregard of constitutional obligations so wanton, taunts and jeers so bitter and insulting, should serve to increase excitement in the South, was a consequence flowing as much from reason and patriotism as from sentiment. He must have been ignorant of human nature who did not expect such a tree to bear fruits of discord and division. Section 7. Recording by Sean Stipsky, Kingman, Arizona.